going to discuss the Mauryan period in Indian history. Why do we remember the Mauryas? This is a major landmark in Indian history, as for the first time in Indian history, one comes across the formation of a very large territorial polity, a territorial polity that embraced nearly the whole of the subcontinent, not the entire subcontinent, but nearly the Pan-South Asian subcontinent. We also find that the Maurya period lasted for nearly about 137 or 140 years. It is also interesting to note that one of the major artifacts of the Mauryan period, the very well-known celebrated lion capital on a pillar of the time of Asoka, now serves as the emblem of the sovereign Republic of India. This is the point that immediately connects our modern experience with an empire of remote past. The Mauryan period is also remembered because of furnishing for the first time in Indian history durable written documents, often administrative documents, written down on imperishable rocks for the first time in Indian history. I mean here the inscriptions of Asoka, about which we shall talk repeatedly in the program. The other advantage of studying the Maurya period is we have here a number of sources of more or less reliable nature, and the sources also are often pretty contemporary to the period we are discussing. The Maurya period is considered also as a landmark in Indian history because during the rule of the Mauryas, we see for the first time the introduction on a very regular basis, the use of stone as a material for the art of sculpting. So the Mauryan period is considered as a landmark in Indian history, not merely for the major political achievements, not merely for the statecraft it bequeaths to us, but also for significant cultural developments. We shall also encounter during the period of our study the Mauryan social and economic life along with the cultural history of the period. The Mauryan period is definitely a major phase in the history of Indian political history, particularly history of the political developments in ancient India, largely because of the presence of three charismatic political personalities, namely Chandragupta Maurya, his son Bindusara, and the third ruler, son of Bindusara and grandson of Chandragupta Maurya, the greatest ruler of this dynasty, Asoka. The Mauryan period in Indian history emerges at a time about the end of the last quarter of the 4th century BC. Around that time, the most important political power in North India was the Nanda dynasty of Magad. The Nandas were still very much in power at the time of Alexander's incursion into India. We know from the Greek authors that there was a very important and powerful political entity in the eastern part of India, that is to the east of the kingdom of Porus. This kingdom is called in Greek accounts as the kingdom of GANGARIDAI and PRASIOI, with its capital at Palibotra or Pataliputra. This is the mighty political power of the Nandas. The Nanda rulers and the Alexander's army did not finally come into any conflict. So, at the time of Alexander's return from India by about 327 BC, the Nandas were still in power in Ganga Valley with their apex political center at Pataliputra. It is by eclipsing the political presence of the Nandas that the Mauryas came into the political scene. So, the Mauryan rule in the subcontinent cannot begin perhaps before 325-24 BC. We can keep it at least safely not later than the last quarter of the 4th century BC, that is in and around 325 BC. The Mauryan rule begins with the coming of the first ruler, Chandragupta Maurya. But before we take him up, we would like to say a few preliminary words about how we know the Mauryas. Sources are absolutely crucial to know the past, because in the sources are recorded or they remain the memories of a particular period in the past. So, to understand the Mauryas, we have to look at the sources relevant for the study of the Mauryas. Now, what are these sources? We began earlier by telling that the Mauryan rule possibly came into existence soon after the return of Alexander's army from India. Therefore, it is likely that some notices of the Mauryan rule will be recorded in the Greek accounts. There are two types of Greek accounts. One, some memories of the Mauryas, and particularly the first ruler Chandragupta Maurya, who is called Sandrocottus in the Greek texts. These Greek texts speak of the arrival of the Mauryas and the engagements of the Mauryas, particularly Sandrocottus, soon after the return of Alexander from India. It is true that such Greek authors are not contemporary to Alexander's period or even contemporary to the time of Chandragupta, but the memory of Chandragupta's initial rise to power, Chandragupta's emergence to political prominence, is somehow captured even in these late writers like Plutarch, like Justin. But then there is one very important contemporary Greek writer. We mean the Greek ambassador, envoy. His name is Megasthenes, who was sent by Seleucus Nicator to the court of Chandragupta Maurya. This Greek envoy, Megasthenes, wrote an account about his impressions of India, and this is known as the Indica. Unfortunately, the text is lost. But fortunately enough, the text is somehow available to us in the form of summaries, excerpts, quotations made by some later Greek authors who based their accounts on Megasthenes. These later Greek authors never came to India but used Megasthenes as their source of information regarding India, the condition of India during the time of the Mauryas. These authors are, if we put them chronologically, Diodorus Siculus, a man from Sicily. That's why his last name is Siculus. His text is Bibliothecus Historicus, written by about the late 2nd century BC. Then we have the account called Geographicon by Strabo, late 1st century BC. finally, we'll use the text called Indica, not the Indica of Megasthenes, but Indica written by Mauryan in about 2nd century AD. At the same time, one has to also keep in mind that the sources, the Greek texts written by Diodorus Siculus, Strabo and Mauryan, they however differ in using Megasthenes because they are summarizing Megasthenes. So all the summaries are not identical and there are internal discrepancies, maybe some inaccuracies in these sources. And we have to use the Greek accounts in the light of two other types of sources. One such source is the very well-known Kautilya Arthasastra. The term Kautilya Arthasastra means that it is written by, or the text is attributed to an author, Kautilya, who is also very popularly known as Vishnugupta or Chanakya. Was there really a person, Kautilya, Vishnugupta, Chanakya, more or less contemporary to the Mauryan period? A Sanskrit drama named Mudra Rakshasa, written by Vishakadatta, speaks of Chanakya as a prime minister of Chandragupta Maurya. But when this text is composed, the drama of Vishakadatta, namely Mudra Rakshasa, was written in 7th century AD, that is nearly about 1100 years after Chandragupta's rule. So we have to be very cautious in jumping to the conclusion that Kautilya, Chanakya, Vishnugupta was really a historical person and acted as the prime minister of Chandragupta. What is beyond doubt is that the text called Arthasastra is a remarkable text on polity and statecraft. This is a normative treatise, a text on polity telling what an ideal king should do. It recommends the various aspects of statecraft, making of the policies of the state with a very strong emphasis on the political economy, the resource base of the state. As the very name of the text is Arthashastra, it has a significant thrust on the matters relating to artha, material matters, finance, and also management of the power of the state. This is a text which recommends, it's a prescriptive text. It is also very difficult to establish that the text was written by a single author in a given single period. The authorship and the dating of the Arthashastra is a controversial matter. It will be suffice to say that one of the most significant research on this text was made by the scholar named Thomas Trautmann, who made a statistical account of the linguistic peculiarity of the text. He reached the conclusion that at the present shape, it cannot be placed anything earlier than 1st or 2nd century AD. Then, are we going to discard this text? Not at all. Because the earliest portion of the text, which is called the ADHYAKSHAPRACHARA, the term means in which section the text prescribes the ideal functions of the heads of different administrative departments. This portion of the text belongs to the 3rd century BC. Whether or not the text belonged to the Maurya court, that is an immaterial question. The important point is the most ancient part of the text that deals with the ideal functions, I repeat the word ideal functions, of different administrative heads is more or less contemporary to a period when the Mauryas were ruling. That is why we would occasionally use the Arthasastra as an important source of the Mauryan period, because the earliest portion of the text goes back to the 3rd century BC. Even if we take into account the importance of the Arthasastra, we, however, cannot forget that the Arthasastra lays down prescriptions, recommendations, how an ideal ruler should rule, how an ideal ruler should organize the statecraft. It, however, never says that this is how the Mauryan state was actually ruled. In fact, what we get is a prescriptive text, not a descriptive account of the Mauryan state. There is in any given society a difference between what is a precept and what is a practice. We can use the Arthasastra in the light of other sources contemporary to the Mauryan period. Now there is another source distinctly contemporary to the Mauryan period. By this we mean inscriptions of Asoka. For the first time, not only we get lithic records, imperishable, durable, on which were engraved Asoka's instructions, but no less interesting is the fact that Asoka mostly writes his instructions in the first person. This is something unique even in the entire range of Indian epigraphy. By epigraphy I mean the study of inscriptions. This is the beginning of Indian epigraphy. This is also the unique instance where the ruler speaks to his subjects, speaks to his administrators in first person. This style of addressing in lithic records in first person possibly comes from an earlier tradition, not in India per se. Just before the Mauryans came into political prominence in the subcontinent, in the northwestern borderland of the subcontinent, there was a mighty power, the very powerful empire of the Achaemenids or the Persians, who did control some parts of the northwestern borderland, also the northwestern frontier of the present subcontinent. The long presence of the Achaemenid rule is associated with such inscriptions, say the inscriptions of Darius, who also spoke in first person. It is not unlikely that the Mauryans, particularly Asoka, being aware of such a tradition of writing down lithic records, and also he emulated the Iranian practice of reaching out to his subjects, to his administrators in first person. However, as we shall see later, that beyond this there is no further similarities in the contents and the manner of speaking as done by Asoka and as it was done by the Iranian rulers, the Persian rulers of Iran, and also on the northwestern borderland of the subcontinent. Apart from the inscriptions, we also have large number of coins which can be attributed with some degree of certainty to the Mauryan period. We must tell here that the Mauryan coins do not have the names or figures of any Mauryan ruler. There are particular methods by which experts assign them to the Mauryan period. We shall talk about that particular issue later. Apart from these sources, there are also some field archaeological materials. For example, the Mauryan palace, at least partly, have been discovered from the excavations at Kumrahar, close to present-day Patna in Bihar. There are also other excavated sites belonging to the Mauryan period, like some parts or some levels of the ancient site of Taxila, ancient Takshashila, which was definitely a part of the Mauryan Empire, and also excavations at Bhita. There are some other field archaeological materials belonging to the realm of art history. Take, for example, the sculptures produced during the Mauryan times, which speak of not only the excellence of artistic achievements, artistic standard achieved during the Mauryan period, these also have bearing on the social, political and cultural scenario of the Mauryan times. It is true that the charismatic figure of Asoka looms large in a number of Buddhist texts, though certainly of a period later than the Mauryan times and definitely later than the time of Asoka. These are Buddhist legends, stories like Divyavadana, like Asokavadana, belonging to the well-known Buddhist Avadana texts. However, these belong to a period of, say, roughly 2nd century AD, 3rd century AD, maybe slightly earlier at the turn of the Christian era, but certainly removed far in terms of chronology from the actual time of the Mauryas. Asoka's rule is also occasionally remembered in a much later source, the famous Kashmiri chronicle, the Rajatarangini of Kalhana, but that was written in about 12th century AD, far removed from the time of Asoka. Take, for example, Chandragupta's memory is retained in some of the late Jaina sources because Chandragupta is said to have embraced Jainism in the later phase of his life. This is the context how Chandragupta figures in later Jaina sources. But all these sources are a bit late in the day. Having talked about the sources, we can now turn our attention to the chronology. What do we mean by the Maurya period? How long did the Mauryan rule continue? For this, we have to turn our attention to the Puranas. The Puranas, though later, contain memory of the Mauryan rule, like it retains the memory of a number of other dynasties of ancient times. The Puranas often speak of this dynastic rule in terms of pseudo-prophecies. Why do I say pseudo-prophecies? That is, the Puranas were written later, but they often speak that such and such dynasty will rule for such and such period, as if the authors of the Puranas could actually foresee the rise and fall of those dynasties. But these were not actually prophecies. These were written later but put in a future tense. So in this way, the Maurya rule, according to the Puranic statement, will last. I'll put this word will last in inverted commas so as to say, the Puranas say that the Mauryas will last for about 137 years. So if we start the Mauryan rule just after 325 BC, say about 324 BC, and it lasts for about 137 years, say even 140 years, then the Maurya rule possibly came to an end around 187 BC. If we would prefer to put it on a round figure, we can think of 185 BC. The importance of the Mauryan rule in Indian history rests not on the length of the duration, but for a number of political achievements that the Mauryan period witnessed in a relatively brief span of 140 years. That is why they are remembered in Indian history.